So, what if the grades we give students are actually hiding the truth about what they've learned? In many classrooms, grades mix together behavior, effort, and compliance with the actual learning of content standards. The result then is that a report card often tells us less about student understanding than we may think. This is I Demand a Meeting, a podcast where two educators in private schools talk honestly about leadership, teaching, and the things we don't often discuss in faculty meetings. I'm Jesse, this is Jared, and let's chat about academics, grading, assessment, all those great things. Jared, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm excited to discuss academics. So the last couple of episodes, we talked about academics. We're going to dig more deeply into grading and assessment. But Jared, I feel like one important thing that I really wanted to review from the last episode before we even get into grading and assessments would be, it's important that we remind ourselves, what is it that we are desiring to form in our graduates, or what type of person are we desiring to form? And then what our end goal is, and then reverse engineer our process to create a learning environment that allows us to, or that maximizes the opportunity to create that person. And so we talked in the last episode about, if our desire is to create a laborer, then we need an academic model that supports their ability to get things done on time, very accurately, with limited disruptions to any of that sort of thing. But if our desire is to create a skilled knowledge worker, then they need a different set of things that are being measured in order to prep them for that environment. So for example, if we want to create a skilled knowledge worker, then we need to provide opportunities that are a bit more flexible, that involve collaboration, complex problem-solving skills, iteration, those things. And if our academic model is primarily centered around rote memorization, regurgitation, dumping it and moving on to the next thing, then when the student who's been brought up in an environment like that gets into a skilled knowledge role, they may be petrified with fear and overcome by that when their first boss asks them to work on a project or a task that gives them some autonomy, and they're only accustomed to memorize, regurgitate, dump, and move on. They get petrified of fear and they don't know what to do because they've not experienced what I call the failure cycle, which is failing forward or failing productively, which what I call in the failure cycle, it's try, fail, iterate, and improve, where your boss says, I'm going to give you this task I want you to work on. Give it your first crack at it, and let's touch base and talk through it. Okay, here's where I need you to tweak it, make it better, and then until you get to the final product. And so I feel like, Jared, that's important to lay that foundation as we talk about what we're desiring to form in our graduates. What do you think?
I think the fact that we start with the end in mind sets this whole stage for this conversation of what type of graduate, what type of learner we're trying to produce. And that's going to, as we're going to address in this episode, going to address some difficult questions, not difficult in the sense of unable to solve them, but some real things we need to take a look at about the type of learner from inside the classroom and even outside the classroom that we're trying to develop.
Yeah. Amen, brother. So we're going to discuss together a few of the things that need to be taken into consideration when considering an academic shift. Now, I had, prior to about, maybe 10 years ago, only come from a traditional teaching and learning and grading and assessment model. I grew up in a traditional system. So, ABCDF, late work, all that kind of stuff. And then I taught in a traditional model, and it wasn't until you exposed me to a different way of thinking about teaching, learning, assessment, grading, and asked some really critical thinking questions that got me questioning my understanding of academics as a whole. And I found tremendous value in our conversations about that. But how did these kind of, I would call them divergent thoughts from the traditional way of thinking, even come to be for you? Like, how did you get exposed to this type of thing, and how has it impacted your thinking on academics?
I think what happened to me in my first and second year of teaching, if you remember the days, for those listening, if you were a math teacher like I was, I took my baskets home where students would turn in their homework on a daily or semi-daily basis, whatever it was. So I'm taking these baskets home, lug them in my car, bringing them back. And then after grading homework and that whole process, just like you, Jesse, I was trained in a very traditional model. And then I would go progress to some type of quiz, then a unit test, and so on. My mind first started asking questions. And of course, I got connected to some people that just thought a little bit differently and even worked in a system for part of my career that was just different in the way we addressed assessment and grading. But I started to realize there's a lot of fluff going on in what I'm doing with grading and assessment. Like I feel like I'm forced to play a game. And any teacher listening to this, I think connect with what I'm saying, meaning you're in this conundrum where you're grading and you have an immense pressure to pass students. So that's one. You also have high achieving students that you almost feel like I'm wasting my time grading their stuff. Like they should be maybe helping teach my class. And so I just started feeling kind of awkward about what I was doing. Maybe ethical is the right question. And then you learn as you go forward. I mean, that was just my first couple years of teaching. Could we kind of get out of playing the game of education? I feel like we're playing a game here. Like this is all a big game. The students are submitting things and they're expecting me to give a pretty generous grade on them. And then we rinse and repeat. And I think the game is what started to bother me.
Well, that's good. That's good. And so you identified a couple of key areas right off the bat that can help nudge in a new direction. If the traditional model of teaching and learning and assessing and grading is not giving us the desired outcome or telling us what it is that we want to know, there's some things that we can do differently. The first would be the idea of separating behavior from academic performance. And I don't mean behavior like student behavior, like discipline, like misbehavior. So when we talk about separating behavior from academic performance, what does that look like in grading and assessment?
So part of playing the game that I was noticing in my first few years, then I got exposed to other ways to do assessment. I realized that students, especially if you taught, say, middle and high school, they understood, okay, my current score in the class is an 82. What do I have to do to get to an A or stay away from a C? Just do enough to get by. There's a game within the game of education that's being played. Now, I'm repeating that because it's so important to realize behavior and academic performance, although we say, of course, we should separate behaviors from academics. But to be honest, in my experience from the very first year of teaching, what I was observing, what I was even doing was, oh my goodness, they were all meshed together. And we know this from a research standpoint. Anyone could do a ChatGPT Google search right now, look at what's an average GPA, for example, for a high school, say senior or junior, and what's their ACT performance, and just compare them. You will come across something called grade inflation. I even ran across an article recently. Some of the Ivy League schools are dealing with the same issue. There's a lot of money going in to pay for those tuition dollars, that is, for the education. And there's a little bit of an expectation on that return. So in the private school market, we're no different. We feel some of those pressures. So, Jesse, this is what really started to bug me is that I noticed things like we're going to give this student 25% off their grade because they were late. I'm going to take points off of fill in the blank quiz, test, whatever, because you wrote in the wrong color pen, if they were allowed, that is. Okay. So, wait, what's going on now? And even in the way that I was raised in my educational model was very much the same. As long as you stayed on the straight and narrow path, you did exactly what the teacher asked you to do. So the first thing for us to put on the table that may ruffle a little bit of feathers, we have to be looking at our grades and going, does that 81, whatever that even means, we need to talk about that, represent that this student knows the content at a roughly B minus average? Or is that some type of mixture, melting pot of all kinds of random things that it would take a lawyer to get in here and diagnose how you got to that 81? And I think that's my primary concern when I started teaching. It's still my concern now on the administrative side. What say you? What's been your experience with this?
Yeah, similar. Transitioning from a traditional grading scale and then experiencing some different ways of doing it, and then now back to a traditional model. Although we're making some good progress in my school of evolving a little bit in some really helpful ways that are going to increase student learning and mastery of content. Same, the idea of deducting points because something was late and the impact that can have. And then, but on the flip side of that, things like a student can ask for extra credit at the end of a marking period of a term and say, can I do a whole bunch of extra activities to try to raise my grade? And it may not necessarily be tied to standards or to depth of knowledge or mastery. And so it's things like that that can skew the data where the number you referenced, an 81 or an 84 or whatever, may not be telling us exactly the depth of knowledge or the ability to do the content standard skills. And it necessitates reevaluation on our part.
And I think that's because we mentioned the phrase behavioralism in one of the prior episodes. I think it's just so, back to your laborer comment about the type of graduate learner, behavioralism is that we're trying to model the classroom like real life. And I understand that to an extent. It's a social experience. You learn to interact with your peers, the teacher, taking feedback, and so on. But we have to be looking at our practices and wonder, are we almost confusing the kids by making it the game that I realized very quickly, not just as a young person, but as a first, second, third year teacher? Like, there's a game going on here. One of my favorite summaries of all this, and again, any adult listening to this conversation remembers this from their day too, because that's probably how your school treated assessment. I remember one student said it so well. I asked, it was a high school student at the time. I said, "Hey, how's school going?" He said, "Oh, great. I got an A in this class, A in this one, but I got a B in this one, but I've done the calculations. And if I just get even a D on my last test, I'll still get a B in that class." And I thought, what is wrong with our academic educational system? Like this doesn't seem right. Like that should be against the law or something, And it got me all fired up to think about different ways that we should be doing business.
Yeah. Okay. So then rather than deducting points for late work or using the wrong color pen or writing outside of the margins or whatever it might be, and there's innumerable examples we can come up with. What is a different way that we can score student work to maybe give us a more accurate understanding of their knowledge or skills?
One easy practical step in the separating behavior from academics is anything that you and your team identify as a behavior: turning in work on time, showing up to class on time, using the right writing materials, whatever you're using, all of that, those are behaviors. And take those out of the gradebook. Academics, anything that the child is doing to demonstrate whether they actually know the content standards or learning targets of your class, fair game. That's the simple exercise. And you could do it at your own classroom level, talk as a team, as your whole school. If there are things that are baked into the cake, to Jesse's point about extra credit, which makes no sense if a kid has 104%. Like, how do you have more than what's possible? But there's all kinds of issues here, right? So late work, extra credit, tardies. Now you have an attendance policy that's coming into your classroom. And before you cancel this podcast and say, well, blasphemy, if I don't put that into the grade, how will I ever get the kids to show up to school on time? Well, you better have a good policy about your attendance and tardies and so on, and have consequences for those things. But whether or not that kid in that referring to that's late to your class should now have an 81 or say a 74 because he's late to class all the time, that doesn't make any sense in this of what he actually knows about your English class or your science class and so on. So I think, Jesse, the first thing is to make a list of the things that are baked into that cake of our grade book and go, man, I have a lot of behaviors in here. Take those out. And I even encourage some schools to go as far as maybe you take all those things you want to see. You could call it a character report card. You could call it a behavior report card, and put those things in a separate grading category and then provide feedback on those things throughout the year. But just take it out of the academic playbook, if you will.
Yeah. But here's the thing, Jared. If they don't sign and return my syllabus, then they're not going to pay their mortgage on time.
No,
so, I really need that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I want to be clear. I know Jess and I are joking. I'm not here to criticize anyone who's been in this type of model. This is all I knew as well. Mm-hmm. I'm just suggesting that the behaviors that we're referring to, does it really reflect what the child knows about your content and those standards you're trying to teach? If it has nothing to do with that, it's a side project that's about a behavior or some attendance issue, just report those things separately and assign consequences separately for those things. So this is not a free-for-all, hey, man, let's just come to school and let the kids have some fun and have no consequence. That's not what this conversation is. In fact, I think by the end of this conversation for today's episode, we realize the model that Jesse and I may go back and forth on is actually more rigorous for our students to be successful in.
Yeah. Yeah. So how then should teachers grade student work when it comes in if behaviors are being removed? What are some tools that teachers can use to more accurately assess?
If I could suggest one thing, if we could make a shift, and this is not a new idea, this goes back to Marzano and a bunch of other people for a long, long time that have been talking about these things, that if we can use scoring guides more and get rid of cut score grading, at least not all the time, and to think more skill based in a scoring guide about what a student actually knows about that learning target. I always use the illustration. It's kind of fun if you do it with staff with jump roping, because if you have a bunch of staff members trying to jump rope, it can be kind of fun. But it's everybody knows this intuitively. I've done this with, say, 3 or 4 staff members. I'll bring them up in front of everybody and say, give them a jump rope, and then I secretly tell them, hey, you be awesome at this. Please be terrible. And then the 2 in the middle, I'd say, be pretty good, but not great. And then have one right below terrible. That's okay. You're not terrible, but you're not even really at average yet. You're just still kind of behind the pack, and like, got it. And then I'm really communicating to them what I would see in a scoring guide that would describe a not great jump roper all the way to an excellent jump roper. And then they're trying to demonstrate it. And of course, you do the exercise, the staff all kind of watch it, especially when you're doing training on this. And it's just so intuitive and easy for people to realize that person's phenomenal. That was terrible. And then the middle is where we start to argue a little bit about, well, that person had a little bit of skill, but they didn't have this. But then when we start to debate those things, Jesse, that's where a scoring guide comes in to guide the conversation for our classrooms and our grading. That is, if you're going to separate academics from behavior, report behavior separately, those scoring guides like your North Star. And that goes to the point of, it tells the student from the very beginning, here's what I'm expecting of you in this unit. I am going to be grading you based upon your performance according to this scoring guide with very specific things. If you want a 4 out of 4 in all these categories, to kind of just use that model, this is what it needs to look like. In fact, Jesse, I might even go a step further. Remember the days when you and I were in school and it's like, oh, you can't do answer keys. We don't do answer keys. It's only the even problems in the math book because the odd ones have the answers. Remember that those days?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, if we go down this route of being very transparent in our scoring guides, I might even give a student a sample of what a perfect, air quotes, or a mastery level performance looks like on this unit, project, or essay, whatever it is, math test. And then I might give them, back to my jump rope, I might give them an example of something that would be maybe a 1 out of 4 or a 2 out of 4. I think that's where the breakdown comes in, is like, oh yeah, that sounds great, Jared. Let's go to scoring guides. But if we leave kids hanging by not giving them enough information, and to steal a page out of what Jesse, you I thought so well said in the last episode, the magic schools and the AI stuff that's out there now, this is at just the drop of a pen. We can get all this information to our students very quickly, even with sample work of what we're looking for. Because what this does, Jesse, is it takes the gamesmanship out of it, and it makes it very clear that this is what I'm looking for. This is not a game. If you want a 3 out of the 4, there's the expectation. You want a 4 out of 4. But it's not this just oblivious sort of, I think that's like a 94. Well, why is it a 94? Because they missed one question? Well, what does that even mean? I think cut score grading has to be put into a certain type of category. So if you're grading, let's say, math homework, and you give the kids 20 questions and you say, well, I'll give a 90 or above if they miss 2 or less. Well, what if those problems are very, very important? If you're looking at certain learning targets and skills, maybe those 2 problems were one of the skills you really wanted the kids to learn. And now you're just lumping it all into a 90 some, percent grade. So there's a lot of issues. I think if we could be more specific in our assessment and use scoring guides, I think that'll help lead us down a road where we get better feedback to students and kind of get out of the game a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That idea of, missing 2 things gets you X grade makes me think of pilot training. Like, imagine if that was the case for pilot training and the 2 things they missed were like landing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just landing.
Not good.
And what that would not be good. Yeah.
Yeah. He comes on the intercom and goes, I'm an excellent pilot, except landing a little spotty.
Yeah. Yeah. But I got a 90. And so, yeah. Okay. So yeah, scoring guides, very important. Now, let me tell you just a very quick story. It'll be a short one. Then I'm going to bounce it back over to you. So I'm back working in a school with a traditional grading and assessment model. And we produce highly effective graduates, highly intelligent, go on to do really big things in life. But a couple of key distinctives within our academic model currently that we market as a really good thing to prep our graduates is we don't accept any late work on daily grade assignments. So when it's due, it goes in as a 0 and it stays a 0. And so you can't, be hanging with a D all semester long. And then at the last week of the marking period, turn in a big pile of work and then jump up to an 89 or a 92 or something. We also don't do any test retakes. And so what you got on the test is what you got on the test, and that's where it stays. So with that in mind, what about the idea of quote unquote late work or tests versus this idea of allowing grades to be fluid and updated. Like when you say it that way, allowing grades to be fluid, that sounds like some crazy woo woo stuff. So, what are your thoughts from what you just heard about my traditional teaching and learning model? And what are some important questions that we need to be considering?
And first of all, as we said at the top, traditional grading or a unique grading, kids are going to do great things, be wonderful graduates, they're going to move on. So this is a nuanced conversation for those that really want to know how the classroom works inside and out, but very important for leadership to think through as well. Jesse, I think it's like a lot of things that get politically divisive. On one hand, if you're a school, not just your school, any school that says we don't accept late work, you're kind of like, yeah, we're the hardcore school. And then if you're over here, sometimes public schools get categorized this way, a bunch of hippies over there that have, no accountability and no deadlines for kids. So I want to tie this back to something you said a couple of times now about the type of learner and the type of graduate we're trying to produce. And not just to say what the workforce will look like, but in the quote unquote real world, the question is education developing, I think you used the phrase, a knowledge based skill worker? If a student submits a piece of work, a practice or a test or something to a teacher, and it's not good, behavioralism would say that child's lazy, didn't practice enough, didn't pay attention enough. We just go there automatically in our head. That's just where we go. But you know this, you and I both supervise employees, have done so for quite some time. Sometimes it's because I didn't communicate it very well, what I was asking you to do. Sometimes, your point earlier about the failure cycle, you need a time to wait a minute. And then the feedback, we talked, I think it was 2 episodes ago, about the coaching analogy and the feedback, how important that is. Well, gosh, why do we need coaching or feedback if it's just to turn it in, here's a grade, move on? I want to get you better, student. So if you turn in something that's not sufficient, I want to give you feedback on that. I want to coach you through it. And so I think these phrases, like we're a no late work school or, whatever we use, I just think late work is the wrong phrase, and not to be trying to just skin the conversation here and go around it. I think it's because we have to think, are we trying to develop a child who now has a clear skill deficiency? And if we're going to put the label in the category of lazy and didn't pay attention, that's fine. Or, he just can't quite do this to that B or A level. I personally believe, Jesse, you said the phrase, what if learning is the constant and time is the variable? Schools have to decide which way they want to lean. It's got to be one way or the other. And again, we have to report grades at some point. But for a child who's going through an educational model where there's some fluid or flexibility with the conversation I just set up here, I think what it could do is have high expectations that you're going to turn in a piece of work. And if it's not sufficient, I don't want to play the game and just average it out, throw it in the grade book and move on. In fact, that's a lot easier for me as a teacher, but it frustrated me. I used the Swiss cheese analogy in a prior episode as well. Just the holes get bigger and bigger. And then we pass it on to the next grade level teacher and they say, thank you so much. So this child doesn't know this. So here's where I think would be a more rigorous approach that maybe gets away from the late work, no late work debate. What if your teacher in every class, not at your school, any school, you said, all right, here are the 15 power standards. That's a lot. Okay, 15 standards, maybe 3 to 5 power standards. They need to know this for the first semester. No questions asked. Got it. And if that's where you land, what if your job as a teacher is to say, I want every child to learn all of this. That's my goal. Now, they need to put in the time and the effort, but I want to help them get there. And I think where the rigor comes in, Jesse, is why do we pass kids along who don't know those 15 standards? Like we do it all of the time. Again, back to the example, a kid turns in something it's below proficiency, if you will, and we just say, well, good luck out there. Maybe we'll get on the next test. No. He doesn't know that. That's red alert, 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 alert. Something's wrong in the system. I would propose that a true model, if time could be the variable and learning the constant, that way the learning that happens or does not happen has another opportunity to demonstrate that. And so specifically, it looks like this. Every single standard is required to pass the course at a minimum proficiency level. I realize that in our time-bound system, not every kid's going to get an A, but Jesse, I think you and I could probably learn almost anything if we're given enough time. I might not be able to dunk a 10-foot basketball hoop because of my height and lack of ability, but if you give me enough time on most things, I might take a year to learn something, but I could do it. And it's the same thing in education. So when we approach like a unit, for example, instead of just giving them a pretest, ignoring it, lesson, test. Okay, did my grading, move on. Instead of that model, what if we make all students follow here are all the practice problems, all the things we're doing along the way, and we tell them what the assessments will be, show them the scoring guides, show them the samples of what this needs to look like, and they need to do it in their work and their own terms. And then the test comes, the assessment. And when that comes, let's say a third, that bottom third doesn't do well on it. I would make sure you assess that unit test or whatever it is by skill. Very important. If there's 3 skills on it, give a grade for all 3 of them. In fact, I would recommend the grade book would have not just unit 4 test. I would like decode that. Like, what does that mean? Put the 3 skills in the grade book, and maybe 2 of them, they did great, but 1 of them, not so much. And then my expectation would be that child needs more time, practice, coaching. Maybe he was lazy or she was lazy, but they need more time on task. So if that's the case, have a process in place to say, look, you're going to come back and demonstrate proficiency or mastery or competency, whatever, on this, but you got to put some more skin in the game. You need more practice, just like a coaching model. You assign more practice. They have to come back. Maybe they need to work with the teacher on some special occasions. They come back and you give another opportunity on that particular skill would be my recommendation. Is it bulletproof? Are there problems with it? We could talk an hour on this, but at least it gives a fighting chance that it's not okay to average out your performance. You at least have to make sure you know all of these standards at a basic proficient level.
That's good. Great stuff. Can we touch briefly then, Jared, on practice or quote unquote homework or classwork? We talked about it in episode 1, circling back around now in episode 9. The idea, I just want to flesh out the idea one more time that where practice fits into this entire equation, because as you know, when it comes to assessment time, there may be some students who have not established the essential foundational skills to be successful yet and need a little bit more practice, while there may be others who don't need any practice at all and can demonstrate mastery really quickly and easily. What do you do with that?
I would suggest in the model I just described or some iteration of that, and know the age of your students. I would say for younger students, require practice, but start using the word practice. I would even encourage for lower levels and middle and high school to make a category in your grade book called practice. And I know Allen Iverson, for those of you who know the reference, might be in all of our heads right now, talking about practice. But in that environment, if you put practice in the grade book, what it tells a student is that I am your teacher. I want you to succeed. I'm going to do whatever I can to help you. I'm going to teach you the best I can. I'm going to support you. You're going to have to practice these skills until I know you're at a minimum or to a mastery level of proficiency or exemplary, whatever term you want to use. So I would suggest, Jesse, starting out as a requirement for the younger grades. But by the time you get to, let's just zoom forward to, you can debate middle school years. In high school years, especially the last couple of years of high school, especially those of us that tout college preparatory schools, they're leaving us. If practice is now something that we're requiring for a grade in the grade book, ooh boy, college is going to be not a rough awakening. You and I both know kids are divergent. They'll figure it out. But I'm telling you, if we can't help a junior or senior at least figure out what they need to study and practice, I think we have done something wrong. Again, but it comes down to you start the unit, here's what we're going to learn. And then you might recommend what the practice looks like along the way. Whether it's a writing composition, a 8 to 12 page research essay, if it's a series of math problems. But the student, as long as they know the kinds of things you're going to expect from them, be very transparent. I think the oldest students in our campuses should have practice more as something they choose to do. And at any level, though, preschool, kindergarten, all the way through senior, I'm one of one that holds this belief. I wouldn't put any weight at all in the grade book for practice category. 0. It's just practice. It's preparing you for an assessment, but it's practice. It allows the failure cycle to happen. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, that's where we want the mistakes to happen. And for the older kids, I'd say middle and high school, I have found a good model. Some of you listening are going, this is just out of left field. This will never work. Make the middle and high school students demonstrate sufficient practice to you, AKA turning in their assignments for the admission ticket, as I like to use that phrase, for the test. So if you're nervous that Johnny doesn't know this, he's just been blowing it off, by the way, he needs to learn that skill, make sure he shows you and demonstrates the practice, and you can still record it along the way, but just don't give it any weight. I wouldn't even let that student take that assessment until I have, as the teacher of the class, sufficient evidence, namely the assignments I've been giving to them along the way. And so you have to kind of figure out what works best for your grade level. But generally speaking, I would be a proponent that call it practice. Get rid of the homework category, call it practice. We're practicing skills. That's what education is about. It could be spiritual, behavior, academic. We're practicing skills, allow the failure cycle to begin and go forward that process. I think, to me, Jesse, this is a much more transparent system.
I love it. And I entirely agree with just about everything, but there's one point of emphasis I do want to make that's maybe a little bit different from what you're presenting. You said as the entrance ticket to take the assessment, you would want to see some evidence of learning. But let's say we've got a 99th percentile kiddo who we know can just dominate anything you put in front of him or her, then I would be inclined as the teacher to let that student take a crack at the assessment. And if he does amazing, then it would not have been in either of our best interests, me to assign and grade practice and him to complete it, him or her to complete it, knowing that they could just do that. So I would be inclined in certain instances to let them take a crack at an assessment with no practice, but then we can talk about reassessment after this. But then in order, if they don't get the score that they desired, or I think they can get in order to reassess, then I would give them in essence like a flight plan for what they would need, what evidence I would need to see for them to complete in order to reassess. What are your thoughts on that?
Spot on. And again, I think what the theme that those teachers listening to this, that Jesse just said that I was describing previously, this is really empowering the teacher. And I know this is a shotgun episode. We're talking all over the place about grading and assessment, but once you develop systems, just like anything in a good, well-organized classroom, student does not pass that test, whether it's a high achieving one at the level they wanted, have a system in place. What's the system? Put the burden of the work on the child, not the teacher. This is where people just lose their minds. Like Jared, I can't run around and go tutor everybody and, oh, how'd you do on this? I got to, no. They can see their score. They know the expectation is you have to pass everything at least call it a C level or higher if you use traditional ABC and so on. So to your point, Jesse, I think as long as the burden goes back to the student on this, then they enter into that flight plan, whatever you might want to call it. They begin the extra practice. They come back to take that assessment a second time for that specific learning target or standard. Jesse, we covered a lot of ground here with grading and assessment and rethinking academics. Give me your hot take for today's episode.
Yeah, my hot take would be there should be no surprises in assessments, like on a test. There shouldn't be any gotcha moments. The students should know that your assessment is going to be standards aligned from what you've taught in that unit, what you've told them all along the way. You're expecting them to know or be able to do. Your scoring guide should be clear, and you use the word, Jared, transparent, meaning they know exactly how you're going to be assessing them and what those standards and expectations are and how it's going to be reported to them, so they know going into it exactly what's going to be asked of them and what they'll need to do. How about you, good sir? What is your hot take?
Grading and assessment, it's a learned behavior that all of us have as educators. Separate behaviors of our students from their academic performance. Even if some of the things described in this episode don't float your boat, at least for now, stay tuned for the next episode. Separate the behavior of the student from their performance on those learning targets and standards. If you can adopt that philosophy, I think naturally you'll have a culture in your school over time that will be a little more learner centered with coaching and feedback and more of a two-way street with academics versus I stand and deliver, you do some things, I mark it in my grade book, we move on. I don't think those days are appropriate for this generation now. Our students want coaching and feedback. They want to be better, but they're only going to rise to the accountability of every learning target needs to be covered, not just in curriculum coverage, but covered in learning. So not just the title of the book, whatever it takes to ensure that students are getting accurate curriculum exposure, whatever it takes to ensure that students are learning the content. Let's make that happen.
That's good. That's good. Now, I'm sure there are some things that you mentioned that sound amazing. Like, let's put the emphasis back on the student and on the worker. Like, I love the sound of that. But I fully recognize there are probably some educators that are listening to this episode whose heads are spinning at this point as we're blowing up their minds, similar to the way you did that for me probably 13-ish years ago when you first exposed me to this stuff. So, how about next we do an episode where we kind of answer some frequently asked questions or address some objections that people might say, yeah, but what about? What do you think?
Let's do that. Bring on the comments and questions too. We appreciate the feedback.
I like it. Let's do that for sure. So, when grading is well done, friends, it becomes a tool that supports learning rather than discourages learning. Clear expectations, honest feedback, grades that reflect real mastery and depth of knowledge is what helps students understand where they are and how they can grow. Ultimately, that's what we should be focusing on as schools, not simply sorting students by percentages or labels, but truly helping them learn and master content and skills and standards. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I Demand a Meeting. Leave a comment or share your own experiences. We desire to hear from you. Keep the conversation going, and we look forward to seeing you next week on the I Demand a Meeting podcast.